Professor Charan Singh, faculty, and my young friends. Not often do we see a full house in Parliament. And I'm glad to see one today here. I intend to speak to you on the state of the economy. And then towards the end, if there are still a few minutes, I'll speak to you on what ails the economy and what are perhaps the short-term and the medium-term solutions. I do so in the firm conviction that none of my advice will be accepted by government. And therefore, perhaps I can come back again next year to speak to you on the state of the worsening economy. But let's hope that things don't turn so gloomy. Like what Winston Churchill said to the Americans will try every method until they find the right one, which I have been advocating for many years. As the financial year draws to a close, it is appropriate to take stock of the state of the economy. You are students of business administration. Among you, there are many scholars and academics. And you will draw your own conclusions from the facts. My task is to present to you a review of the economy from the point of view of a reasonably well-informed citizen and ask some common sense questions. Let's begin with growth. In the first and second quarters of the current year, India's GDP growth was revised to 7.6% and 7.7%, leading to an average of about 7.65%. Is that good or bad or mixed? That depends on what you compare it with. It is good if you compare it with something vague like what are the expectations. It is mixed if you note that growth has been flat in the first 2 quarters. It is bad if you compare it with the first half of last year when growth was much higher. Some would argue the projection for the current year at 7.6% is not too bad. We are not in a crisis. Things are getting better. They may also argue government is doing all it can to take the growth rate to 8 to 10% a year. I want to push back against this complacent view. Between the first half of 2014-15 and the first half of 2015-16, growth decelerated from 7.9% to 7.65%. For the whole year, government's economic survey had predicted an 8% growth, and the government's budget assumed 8.5% growth. RBI's projection for the full year now is 7.4% with a mild downward bias, and finally, the government has reluctantly settled for an estimate of 7.6% for the whole year. I think government is trying to temper expectations down so that at the end of the year they can say, listen, we have done better than what we told you to expect. In my view, 7.6% growth of GDP is not good. Certainly not good for India. We have done better. We can do better. But I'm afraid the government is muddling along. Let us delve a little deeper into these GDP growth numbers. 3 issues should worry us. Firstly, what is the source of this growth? Where is it coming from? Secondly, is it possible that we are overstating growth? More and more voices are being raised against the GDP numbers. And thirdly, are there consequences to abysmally low nominal growth? Let's take them one by one. Where is the growth coming from? As the composition of growth suggests, most of it is on account of low oil prices and low commodity prices, and increased capital expenditure by government, which is good. There is hardly any improvement in the private sector. The mid-year economic analysis confessed that 2 of the drivers of growth, exports and private investment, are sputtering, and there is no sign of any turnaround. All the growth that we are getting is coming out of private consumption and public investment. If you want a comparison, it's like driving a car on 2 wheels. 2 of the engines of growth have virtually stalled. This year, the current year, 2015-16, government delayed the fiscal consolidation roadmap to allow itself an additional borrowing of 0.3% in order to increase public spending. There is no evidence that the increase in public spending has crowded in private investment. Let's take the second question. Are we overstating growth? I have defended the CSO's numbers many years in the past, many times in the past. So I would be loath to call the CSO numbers as wrong. But there is some evidence that we are perhaps overstating growth. For the first time in memory, at least until the first and second quarters, the GDP deflator used to derive real GDP growth from nominal growth was negative. It's only in the latest estimates that the CSOs adopted a 1%, positive 1% as a GDP deflator. Never, or certainly not in recent memory, have we had a GDP deflator which is negative or just 1. This is because of historic decline in global commodity prices, which has pushed wholesale price inflation into negative territory. I was among the first to publicly say that while inflation is bad, perhaps deflation is worse. Negative WPI inflation for several months is not a good sign. Especially with negative WPI and a rising, slowly rising CPI, what it means is producers do not get fair prices while the consumer is burdened with increasing prices. So it's a double whammy for the economy. The producer is sulking, the consumer, she's complaining. This has led to a GDP deflator, which is extremely low, and at the end of the year, who knows, may perhaps turn negative. Which is why nominal growth rate of 8.6% projected for the year is turning out to real GDP growth of 7.6%. If the GDP deflator was more than 1, I'm afraid this nominal GDP growth will turn a very low real GDP growth. So I think there is sufficient justification for people to question the GDP figures and ask themselves, are we overstating growth in the country? If nominal GDP growth continues to be low, government debt as a percentage of GDP will increase fast, and this will make debt all the more difficult to service. Government borrows at about 8%, and if the nominal growth is equal to or less than that, the interest burden of the government will increase. Also, because the denominator is lower than estimated, the fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP will be larger, and in order to meet the fiscal deficit projected in the budget, government would have to slash expenditure or raise more revenues. We will know in about a week how the government has managed to meet the fiscal deficit target of 3.9% they set last year, at the beginning of the year, by postponing the fiscal consolidation by 1 year. These problems affect private firms as well. There is already high financial stress. As far as non-financial firms are concerned, operating profit in Q2 was less than the interest expenses. If growth is lower than the interest rate paid by the firms, the stress will only get worse. It is this stress which is getting reflected on the NPA side of bank balance sheets. My conclusion, therefore, is that there's nothing to be happy about the projected 7.6% growth, and we must therefore find ways to firm up the growth and to raise it beyond 8%. Let me now turn to other economic indicators, beginning with the main driver of growth, namely investment. It is generally accepted that private investments are not picking up, and there are few signs that they will pick up in the near future. Q2 witnessed a decline in private projects announced and those under implementation. Total proposed investments in the first 8 months of 2015 were about 30% lower than in the same period last year. Compared to last year, the pace at which private projects are getting stalled is almost the same, while the pace of revival of stalled projects has declined sharply. To make investments, firms need earnings. In June-September quarter, net sales of firms fell by 5.2% compared to the same period a year ago, making it the third successive quarter of shrinking sales. This, I believe, is the first in recent memory. The manufacturing sector looks particularly bleak. Firms also can invest through borrowings. As per the statement published by the Reserve Bank of India, non-food credit growth is at 11.2%. Credit to industry is only at 5.33%, and credit deployment to medium enterprises actually shrunk by 7.62%. Let us now look at production and exports. India's economy needs manufacturing to pick up, and we must manufacture goods both for the domestic consumption and for exports. Domestic consumption is important because that alone will provide sufficient demand for goods. Exports are important because we need to earn the foreign exchange to finance our imports. April-December, that is the latest figure available. April-December cumulative index of industrial production was 2.62%. In December alone, it was 2.57%. The trend growth rate remains in the range of 2.5 to 5%. Domestic demand, therefore, does not appear to be picking up. I suspect it is because of the distress in rural India and the sharp decline in rural consumption. In fact, farm wages have increased at the lowest rate in the last 2 years in the past decade. Farm sector experts like Dr. Ashok Gulati have warned government about the growing stress in the agriculture sector. Poor competitiveness of the economy is showing up in export numbers. Exports declined by 17.64% in April-January cumulative. Thus, India has seen for the first time 13 consecutive months of exports shrinking year on year. And I suspect you were too polite to ask the minister day before yesterday why this was so. This is not because of petroleum products alone. Non-petroleum products exports declined by 9.57% in the same period. Many categories of manufactured goods are witnessing sharp decline. Every sector, every group is down except ready-made garments, which is growing at a minuscule 1.68%. Global slowdown is indeed the cause, and I concede that. But the pace of decline in China's exports is 1/3 of that in India's exports. Receipts from services exports fell by 0.54% in April-December. Services exports have been stagnant for a while now. We have never had such a long stretch of poor export performance since 1991-92, the year of crisis. Nobody in government is willing to talk about it. Nobody in government seems to know what to do except to blame the global situation. Let me now say a few words about what concerns most ordinary people and most families. It is jobs. There are no campus placements in rural India. Nobody visits farms to say, is there an underemployed pair of hands here, and shall I place you in my company? Wherever you go, the question is, where are the jobs? We're not talking about jobs for IIT graduates and IIM graduates. We're talking about jobs for 80% of the students who complete less than 12 years of education, and 50% of the students who complete less than 8 years of education. Please tell me, how many firms do you know have created new jobs in 2015? How many people do you know have created employment for themselves, what we call self-employed, through starting a new business? The 26th Quarterly Employment Survey, conducted between April and June 2015, shows the job creation in the manufacturing and export-oriented sectors fell by a net of 43,000 from the previous quarter. This is the worst performance in 6 years. In the same quarter of 2014, these sectors had added 1,82,000 jobs. In spite of all this, the government was and is painting a rosy picture, citing data on inflation, indirect tax collections, balance of payments, current account deficit, fiscal position, FDI, and some international rankings. Let us examine these claims. For more than a year, CPI inflation has been below 6%. Retail inflation was 5.7% in April-January, rising slowly but steadily since last November. A steady decline in inflation began in November 2013, well before the new government took charge. RBI's monetary policy mounted an attack on inflation. The crash of commodity prices and oil prices, because of external factors, tremendously helped in our effort to contain inflation. In all this, therefore, government's role is more or less absent. For example, government has done little to contain food prices. As a result, even while WPI inflation is negative and retail inflation is only 5.7%, food prices inflation is 6.6%. The finance minister cited the increase in indirect tax collection as evidence of economic improvement. Most of this increase, as anyone who reads the papers knows, is due to increased tax rates. Much of the decline in oil prices has been mopped up by increase in excise duties and customs duty. Net of the additional tax measures that were imposed post last budget, indirect tax collections are growing only at 11 to 12%, which is normal. The current account deficit is indeed low at 0.64% at the end of Q2, but that is because petroleum and gold prices are at historic lows. If those prices had remained where they were 2 years ago, the current account deficit would have been more than 3%. Low oil prices have also given a fiscal bonanza, a lower energy subsidy bill, and a higher excise duty collection from petroleum. Thanks to the sharpest global commodity and oil price corrections, India's inflation is about 6%. I ask you, what will happen when we are not the beneficiaries of this global benevolence? This commodity cycle will indeed turn one day. Oil and commodity prices cannot remain at this level forever. If oil remains at this level forever, nobody will produce oil. As it is, in the last 12 months, every major oil company has sharply cut back fresh investment. Never before has Brent quoted at below $30 a barrel. When the commodity cycle turns, we will pay a price unless we fix the problems in our economy and ensure that the economy's non-inflationary rate of growth, while commodity and oil prices are at the normal level, is close to 8%. Question is, are we doing it today? Are we fixing the roof when the sun is shining? The government is celebrating increase in FDI from US dollars 36 billion in 2013-14 to US dollars 44 billion in 2014-15, and from US dollars 31 billion to US dollars 41 billion in April-December of 2015. Now, these are impressive figures, but I must point out that FDI was US dollars 42 billion back in 2008-9 and 46.5 billion in 2011-12. So these highs are not new. We have touched these heights in the past. The last major jump in FDI occurred between 2005 and 2007 when it quadrupled from US dollars 9 billion to US dollars 35 billion. So the conclusion is FDI has been pretty much range bound between 35 to 45 billion. There is therefore nothing in the latest data that suggests a major boost to FDI. I would be happy if government statements were intended to reassure the people while the government is working quietly to solve the problems. That, however, does not appear to be the case. Except for a few bright spots, there is no evidence that the government has an overarching vision or strategic goals or definite intentions and a work plan to move steadily forward. If there is one theme that defines the governance approach of the present government, it is this. There is a lot of activity, but little action. When the government acts, it does so without a strategy. Every now and then, a new scheme or project is announced without following up with sound implementation. Swachh Bharat was announced with so much fanfare, but the number of toilets constructed every year under Swachh Bharat is lower than what was constructed during the previous years. Similar stories can be told for other schemes. For example, one of your teams was gullible enough to swallow the story that Jan Dhan program was the first to create bank accounts. And he said 20 crore accounts have been created. The earlier financial inclusion program created 34 crore accounts by 31st of March 2014. And for some reason, and I've asked the RBI to confirm it, for some reason, the 34 accounts get Cinderella treatment and the 20 accounts get a different treatment. He also swallowed the story that every one of these accounts will get a credit of 5,000 rupees. The account will get a credit only if the account is active. And 50% of these accounts are totally inactive. I think he should go back and ask the last question which he forgot to ask. How many of these accounts have been seeded with 5,000 rupees? The number is a very, very small number. I think less than 1,000. With about 13 million youth entering the labor market every year, we need to create more than 1 million jobs a month. I'm not claiming that any government in the past has achieved that. Every government has fallen short. In India, to get growth with job creation, the government must have a two-pronged strategy. Investments in human capital, and I'm glad a team mentioned that, and reforms of markets. Investing in human capital means investing in health, education, nutrition, and sanitation. And in the last budget, allocations to vital sectors and vital programs were cut. It was estimated that the cut was as much as 75,000 crore rupees. Reforms of markets include reforms of markets for products, such as agriculture, industry, and services, and markets for factors of production, such as land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. These agendas cannot be fulfilled without improving the administrative capacity of the government. My advice to government, in the sure knowledge it will not be accepted, is that please first acknowledge that Government of India is a continuing entity. There is no such thing as my government or your government. It is our government. Every government must build upon what was done by the previous government. The UPA government gave India its best decadal performance since independence. Lest you forget, let me remind you, the 10-year GDP growth was the best ever at 7.5% under the old series and 7.7% under the new series. Never before did a 10-year period witness a growth of about 7.5%. Every crisis, and I'm grateful to the person who introduced me, every crisis, 2008 and 2012, was faced with courage and sound policies. A good recovery was underway. GDP growth had jumped from 5.1% in 2012-13 to 6.9% in 2013-14 when the baton was handed over to the new government. A recent research paper showed that the best performance in job creation in the manufacturing sector was between 2003-04 and 2011-12. Job creation rose 7% annually, much higher than job creation in the previous periods of high growth, although still falling short of the goal of 1 million jobs a month. At the moment, there seems to be little appetite in the government to acknowledge that there was anything good about earlier governance models. That is unfortunate. But what is worse is the deep cuts in the budgetary allocations for agriculture, drinking water, education, and nutrition programs. The cuts seem to suggest that these are not priorities of the government. This must be reversed. India still has millions of low-income households who do not have the resources to invest in their children's human capital. The government cannot turn its back to them. The government cannot leave them behind. If we do not make these investments today, we will see that even if jobs are created, we would not have a skilled and healthy labor force to match the requirements of those jobs. Let me remind you of what one of the teams said. The average fifth-class student is barely able to reach a second-class textbook or do a second-class math question. On the economic front, the government should first complete the unfinished agenda of previous governments. For example, the GST is an imperative, but the bill before Parliament is deeply flawed. If the suggestions to amend the bill, at least on 3 crucial points, are accepted, the bill can be passed easily. The government seems to have abandoned the direct tax code and implicitly abandoned the recommendations of the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission. These are serious mistakes. These ideas came out of years of deliberation and careful analysis and should be taken forward to the logical conclusion of new laws and a new regulatory framework. Let me conclude on a note of optimism. Among the young people of India, who make up nearly 65% of the population, there is hope, aspiration, and above all, energy. Among business persons, there is innovation, creativity, and the spirit of risk-taking. Among professionals, there is a competitive spirit and a desire to be the best among the world. In many institutions, there are reformers and institution builders. All these positives can be harnessed if the political leadership of the country makes a sincere and well-determined effort to build a consensus, reach out to all sections of the polity and society, focuses its energies entirely on development and reform, and install the belief that the government has the welfare of all the people of India at heart. In recent months, we have seen too many acts and too many incidents of, what shall I say, to put it mildly, foolishness. maybe the acts were unintended. Maybe the incidents were unplanned, although I have serious doubt about that. But once you do something, the consequences must be foreseen. And therefore, one must presume that they are intended. Anyone who cannot foresee the consequences of his action must be presumed to intend his actions. There is still time to pause, reflect, make a course correction, and press forward. In fact, the mid-year economic analysis presented by the government, or may I say allowed to be presented by the government, was not an act of foolishness. It was quite an act of bravery on the part of the chief economic advisor. But that is a good starting point. The ills that plague the Indian economy and which need to be addressed in the budget that will be presented in a few days and in the years ahead are, one, there's a loss of confidence in the reform process. People are beginning to ask questions. Will you continue the reform process? Two, the balance sheet crisis of private firms. That crisis is deepening. Three, a very bizarre inflation situation. The WPI continuing to be in negative territory and the CPI rising slowly but steadily. Four, the suspicion that the Indian economy is actually doing worse than what the data reported suggests. And five, the complete collapse of the agriculture sector, where 65% of the people are dependent and 50% of the labor force is employed. So these are challenges. I wonder who among you will step forward 10 or 20 years later to stand up in Parliament and present a budget. To that man or woman, I offer my good wishes and thank you.